And we're back for episode 12 of StandPoint. I'm Gabe Groisman, and I'm so honored today to have with us Senator Marco Rubio. Usually on this show, I do long intros of who our guests are so everybody knows who they are and to level set, but today we don't have to do that. Senator Rubio, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank
Today we're going to cover some interesting topics. Obviously, TikTok, which is the topic of the week. Also, the new era that we're facing in Latin America with some big positive changes. Senator Rubio just came back from a trip there from Argentina, the homeland where my parents and grandparents came from. And also some news out of Israel or out of the Democratic side of the Senate and things that they're trying to push now with Israel. And we'll get to hopefully all three of these topics. So Senator Rubio, just to jump in, the House passed a bill this week, as you know, requiring TikTok to cut ties with the parent company, ByteDance, that owns the algorithm that drives TikTok. That's in turn controlled by the CCP. You've spoken out about this and how this is a national security threat to the United States. I think this is really just some sort of technical thing on social media, but really there is a national security implication here.
issue for two reasons. The first is it's highly technical. It's a new area of threat to the country, and I'm going to try to explain that in a moment. And the other is that it's very popular. People like it. And it's actually what makes it so popular that makes it such a threat in some ways. Let me explain what I mean. TikTok is a social media app. I describe it to people as these short form videos, and they're very popular. But the thing that makes it very popular is the thing literally reads your mind. And meaning the more you use it, the more it knows the kinds of things you like and like to watch and the kinds of things you're not that interested in. And so the more you use it, the more it feeds you things you like. And suddenly it starts feeding you things you didn't know you liked. Or even knew existed, but they knew you would like it once you saw it. And that's all based on an algorithm. This is artificial intelligence. That's what this is. People ask about what artificial intelligence is. This is what it is. The ability of machines to learn about human behavior and to predict human behavior. To, in essence, predict what it is you're going to like. Okay, all of that is built on artificial intelligence, and it's all built on an algorithm. Now, that algorithm is not owned by TikTok. It's owned by their parent company. The name of the parent company is ByteDance. And ByteDance is a Chinese company. It's headquartered in China. Under the laws of China, that parent company, ByteDance, that owns TikTok, but more importantly, owns the thing that makes TikTok special, under Chinese law, they have to do whatever the government tells them to do. Whatever the government tells them to do, ByteDance has to do. And so if, as they have done now in Taiwan and in some other countries, the Chinese Communist Party goes to ByteDance and says, we want you to use this algorithm and everything you've learned about the people in that country to change their values, change their opinions, change how they're going to vote, or try to influence what they're going to see, what kind of messages are going to be out there. ByteDance has no choice but to do it. Now, the way they'll defend it is by saying, well, but TikTok is American. It's in America, and the data of Americans is in America. And look, there's value to that data, but the value of the data is not the data. The value of the data is that data, which is made up of who you are, where you live, what you watch, what you like, what you buy, where you've been, all those things, that data is what feeds that algorithm. That's what that algorithm is built on. And so there's no way that the engineers at ByteDance in China can have an algorithm that works unless they have access to the data, no matter where you store it. You can store it like Oracle does in Texas. The engineers at ByteDance in China have to have access to it because the algorithm doesn't work without it. And so what this law would do, and what we've argued for a long time is, TikTok can continue to operate, but it has to divest and has to separate from ByteDance. In essence, ByteDance has to sell it. And ByteDance says it won't, primarily because the Chinese government won't allow it. If ByteDance were allowed to sell today, they'd probably get out $690 billion. I mean, their valuation is very high. They probably would sell. It's not a bad deal at this point. It's not. I think the problem is the Chinese government will not allow it to be sold. And they will not allow the algorithm to be sold. And so people ask, well, how does this become a problem? Well, it's not a problem immediately. First of all, it'd be hard to tell it's a problem because some of this is slowly building up. But imagine, for example, that the United States and China are headed for a conflict somewhere in the world, Taiwan, anywhere. And suddenly ByteDance's algorithm is adjusted so that the family members of people who serve in the military start to see videos about how horrible it's going to be for Americans, how they're going to die, why it's so stupid for America to get involved. And all of a sudden, we're going to have people pressuring political leaders not to keep TikTok alive, like you're seeing now, they're going to be pressuring them, do not go to war with China. I don't want my son or daughter to die. It's not worth fighting. It's not worth fighting this war, whatever it may be. Now, people have a right to express that view, but we have a real concern about American public opinion being manipulated by a foreign power. Now, one more point I would make. Here's one of the arguments you're going to hear people make is, well, how's that any different from what Facebook and Meta does, or we know what other social media companies? Well, number one, it's true. They all have algorithms. They all build it on data. And I'm not saying that that shouldn't also be looked at, but there's a big difference between something that's controlled by a company whose CEO we may not like, or who have a history of doing things that we don't like. We should deal with that. But there's a big difference between that and something that's controlled by a foreign government, not just a foreign government, but a foreign government that wants to not just be an alternative to America in the world. They want to replace America. They want to become the most powerful nation on earth. They want to weaken America in the process. And there's a big difference between something like this, owned by that kind of government, and by an American corporation, who, by the way, if they want to pass bills tomorrow that may allow us to sue social media companies for the decisions they make, like censorship, I'm for that too. We should do that. But that's but I don't think the answer to the problem of Meta, wherever we mean Instagram and Facebook and all that, I don't think the answer to that is to allow the Chinese to continue to operate in this way. So this is where has this come to a head. And I believe, I'm pretty confident I'm the first member of Congress back in 2019 that called attention to this problem. It started building up steam. The work with the Trump administration in 2020. They tried to do a ban. The court said they didn't have the authority, and that's why Congress passed a law.
Yeah, it's taken some years for people to really look at this as a real issue, as opposed to sort of a conspiracy theory. But we're seeing it play out. I can just tell you, a young cousin who's a university student at NYU, and the discord that TikTok sows on college campuses and really around our country is incredible. She was comparing with her friend their TikToks and the algorithms, what they were showing on, for example, what was happening between Israel and Hamas, where most college students were getting just pure lies and propaganda on their TikTok, and of course then driving them to go to these protests and to have these crazy opinions that we're seeing all over our country against Israel, against the United States. Whereas this one student, her TikTok looked totally different. And really it's the algorithm itself. The real question always ends up being whether, and I don't know if we know the answer to that, whether there's evidence that the Chinese government itself is sowing the discord, or whether it's just the way the algorithm works and it just drives people, to the edges of their propensities.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing about national security, right? North Korea has nuclear weapons, and we're very concerned about them. They've never launched them against anyone. North Korea there's no evidence that North Korea has ever used nuclear weapons, or that the Russians have for that matter, or that the Chinese have for that matter. So why are we concerned about nuclear weapons? They've never been used. The answer is not that they've never been used, but that they could be used, and that we know they plan to use them in a time of conflict. That's why we're concerned about not just nuclear weapons, but any other military capabilities that they have. And that's the same here. There's a very powerful weapon for psychological warfare, for cognitive warfare, for influencing elections and American politics. It's a very powerful tool, and it's a very difficult thing to prove until after the fact that they've used it, because unlike a weapon, you don't see some detonation. These are algorithms. They're highly technical. They're very complicated, and it's difficult to know ahead of time or identify it until it's had its impact and it's too late. But the fact that they haven't done it yet, they have done it. They have done it in Taiwan. They have done it. There's evidence all over the world that the algorithms on TikTok censor speech on things like Uyghur Muslims and Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Tibet and the Dalai Lama and any issues that the Chinese are, Tiananmen Square, for example. You're not going to see a lot of videos on that anywhere in the world on the TikTok app, because they don't allow it in China, but they allow that. That's the irony. But they allow it everywhere, all over the rest of the world where they spread it. So the fact that they haven't done it this way, the capability exists and the intent exists to wage like psychological warfare on the United States. The only thing missing is the opportunity or the conflict in which they would do it. Same with cyber. We know that the Chinese have penetrated all sorts, have tried to penetrate, and have penetrated everything from water systems to the electrical grid of this country to the banking system. They haven't done it. They haven't shut out the power grid of the United States, but they would in a time of conflict. So in national security, we are always worried about potential weapons and tools available to an adversary that could potentially be used in a time of conflict. And this is one of them.
So before we move on it, are we going to see the Senate take this issue, take up this bill? Or are we going to see it pass the Senate? It seems to be more controversial in the Senate than in the House.
Well, there's a couple things. I think there's some people that just don't understand the issue well. I think there's some people that are frankly, and I understand, uncomfortable with the idea that we're going to ban something that over 100 million Americans have on their phones. They're not in favor of government doing that. There are some people that come from it from a very pure libertarian standpoint of the government shouldn't be involved in this. And then, frankly, there's a lot of lobbying and a lot of money going around. I mean, the TikTok has spent millions of dollars. They've hired all kinds of lobbyists on both sides of the. They've hired former staffers of key senators to lobby on this issue. I mean, it's an all hands on deck. They have spent more money on lobbying probably than any other company up in Washington in the last 6 months or a year. So there's a lot of that going on too here. And so, look, nothing in the Senate moves as fast as things do in the House. But I'm glad we're going to have this debate, and I'm glad we're going to be able to educate people about it. And we'll see when the time comes. It'll ultimately be up to Senator Schumer, who's the majority leader now, to decide whether something comes to the floor or not. It had a big support in the House, and I think that should be something we take into consideration. But we'll have to work it. I mean, I recognize that for most people, they still haven't heard all the arguments on both sides here. It's an important policy debate, and one I'm glad we're going to have, and I hope we can get a good outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So one place where China has sunk its teeth into really is Latin America, and we see them taking over. In the United States, we finally pushed back against Chinese technology being used in our ports, but now that's something that's rampant in Latin America. We've seen socialism on the rise throughout the region, poverty on the rise throughout the region as a result. But there are some bright spots. My country, where my parents and grandparents are from, Argentina. You just came back from visiting President Milei. By the way, just the pictures are incredible. This guy's personality is one for the history books. I've had the pleasure of meeting him right before he was president, and a really impressive guy, an economist who's really pushing capitalism and pushing against corruption in Argentina, and we're already starting to see some results. So just first, how was that meeting? What was it like to be in Buenos Aires and finally a new day there?
Well, it was a great meeting. First of all, I know his personality is, eccentric in some people's minds, but the guy's a very serious guy, one-on-one. He's a real legit economist. He's got real ideas about what he's trying to do. And look, he's trying to unravel 60, 70 years of really bad public policy, basically leftist populism, that's destroyed the Argentine economy that 100 years ago was, I think, the 8th or 9th largest in the world. And now, it's one of the largest debtor to the IMF, International Monetary Fund, for example. And Argentina's problem is they have America's spending problem, like we do here in America, but not America's credit rating. So they can't get any more funding. So it comes to a head here. And he's now had 2 months of surpluses as a result of the decisions he's been able to make as president. And I think that's beginning to change concepts internationally about investment in Argentina. I think the other opportunity is the one you touched on. Look, the Chinese are trying to become a global power, so they're trying to play everywhere, and they're interested in three things. The first and foremost is the exploitation of raw material. If you have lithium, if you have rare earth minerals, if you have farmland, if you have oil or natural gas, if you have natural resources, they want to exploit it. They want to come into your country. They want to buy up long-term.
And Argentina has all of those things.
They do. So Argentina is a pretty significant source of lithium already. I think they have the potential to even surpass Chile as an exporter. They sell a lot to China now as a result of deals that were done in the past, but they have the opportunity to expand that even further and to do it in ways that the Chinese companies don't know how to. Environmentally safe, and that would actually locally employ people as opposed to what the Chinese do, which is import workers. So my view of it is this: when there's a country that elects a leader and that leader says, I want to get closer to America and less reliant on China, I think it is in our national interest to reciprocate. It's in our national interest to say, here's a leader that wants to get closer to America, and we should reciprocate. And it's important for those leaders to be able to go to their people and say, these are the benefits of being closer to America: investment, partnership, security cooperation, mutual respect. They pay attention to our issues. That's important. And I think that should be important for our country. When someone says, I want to be a friend of America, America should say, yes, and we want to be your friend in return, and we want to do more things together. So that's the opportunity we have in Argentina above all else. Internally, they'll make their own decisions about what direction they want. And as someone who believes in limited government and fiscal sanity, I obviously, find a lot of appeal to what President Milei is outlining. But that's up for the people of Argentina to decide. What I think is in our national interest is we have a president that says, I want Argentina to be allied to the United States and less dependent on China. We should embrace that and say, how can we build on that? How can we make you successful in that endeavor so that you can go to people and say, you see, if you're a friend of America, it's good for your country. It's better to be friends with America than it is to be friends with China, Russia, Iran.
Yeah, man, it's foreign policy 101, basic foreign policy, but somehow, for some reason, we're not seeing the administration make those overtures, even though Argentina has rejected BRICS now. He said on his campaign that he's not going to do business with China. He's going to allow Argentinians to do whatever they want from as private individuals, but as a country, he's not going to do that. He's clearly making overtures to the United States. Why is it that we're not seeing that reciprocation from the president and from the White House?
Well, I think our lack of doing that falls usually into one of two buckets. The first is just sheer negligence. We just don't pay enough attention in the Western Hemisphere, and I think that's a broad problem that we face. That's number one. The second problem that we have is we have this tendency, particularly because they're not paying as much attention at the high levels, it empowers lower level people at the State Department and sometimes in the embassies themselves to basically act like bullies, to basically go into countries and say, well, we don't care if you want to be closer to the United States. We don't like that you're doing this or that you're doing that. So in some cases, they're socially conservative countries like Paraguay or Guatemala. And, our embassy gets upset when those governments are not embracing, Gay Pride Month or whatever. And those leaders say, look, we're a socially conservative country. The stuff doesn't go over well here. And so we end up, even though they want to be closer to America geopolitically, we end up condemning them or, sanctioning people or what have you. So that's become a factor. In other cases, it's things like, some army unit 40 years ago committed human rights abuses. And so therefore, we're not going to sell any military weapons to you because of something that generals who have long ago died did 40 years ago. There's no one alive or even involved in the military today that had anything to do with those human rights abuses back in the day. But nonetheless, they still hold the current governments responsible. So there's some element of that as well. So whether it's the Dominican Republic, whether it's people accusing Bukele in El Salvador, who was just reelected resoundingly in an election that no one claims was fraudulent, they accuse him of being a dictator. Whether it's those are the two countries that come to mind that are really trying to get closer to America, and instead we issued sanctions and tried to punish them. It's disturbing, and I think it's important. And because a lot of people in Congress don't pay attention to that part of the hemisphere. A lot of these embassies get away with this stuff too. There's no one, you couldn't do that. It was, the foreign policy of the United States towards Israel, for example, is not set by the embassy. It's set by the State Department. But in a lot of these countries that no one's paying attention, we basically delegate too much authority to these local levels who end up, bullying some of these leaders in ways that are contrary to our national interests. So that's something we need to address by number one, policymakers like myself, others joining me and paying more attention. I was in Paraguay after my trip to Argentina. I think I was the first senator to visit Paraguay in 40 years. There had not been a U.S. senator to visit Paraguay in years. And so it just gives you an example of, obviously, I get it. There's a lot going on in the world. Paraguay is a small country, but it just goes to show there are still a lot of places we just don't pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, Paraguay is another one. It's another important country in Latin America. The new president there is Peña, another conservative young economist. From the party of Horacio Cortés, as you know, from the president before this last one. And what's incredible when you see that and you see El Salvador with Nayib Bukele is how quickly things change in Latin America. If we go from one, in Brazil is the same thing. You go from one side of the political spectrum to the other. It seems like it's up for grabs, and it seems that issues that we are dealing with all over the world, whether it's Hezbollah in the north and Lebanon, who operates throughout Latin America, or Iran, who's the head of the snake of everything that's happening in Latin America, is also behind much of what's happening in South America. And somehow our country continues to ignore it, at least at the executive level under this president. So I'm happy you were there. Nayib Bukele, so you know, he was a former mayor, and I went with him as mayors when I was a mayor to Israel on an international mayor's trip. And he's an incredibly interesting guy, very, very smart, who's making big changes. And again, people in our country, they're upset that the other party has disappeared, essentially. It's like, yeah, well, they were voted out and they were socialist and corrupt. So maybe they're in a better place now than they were before. So thank you for continuing to push in Latin America. As someone whose family comes from there, it's important to me, and I think it's important to America. We're talking now, let's just shift over quickly to Israel. I was going to talk to you about the military assistive funding that has been sort of kicked back and forth, and $16-17 billion to Israel. And that funding seems never to be going through, which we'll talk about in a second. But just before we started here this morning, Senator Schumer put out a statement pushing for a two-state solution now. And it seems to be a reward to the Palestinians for committing the biggest terror act in the history of the state of Israel. What's your position on that? Why is it that we're seeing such a push? Is it really just as shallow as trying to get electoral votes in Michigan, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, there's two elements here. The two-state solution that they're talking about is not Palestinian state and Israelis. It's Michigan and Minnesota. Those are the two states that they're trying to solve for the elections in November. Here's the second point. In a perfect world, like a world of perfect harmony, but it would be great, right? And I think Israel has tried this on multiple occasions, for there to be a land, a territory, a country that Palestinians could call their own, and they would coexist peacefully alongside the Jewish state of Israel. There's complexities over what the land would be, what's the status of each Jerusalem, and all those things that make the deal complicated. And there's realities. The world has changed over 50 years. And that's not unusual. I mean, there's no country in the world whose borders have not changed and moved as a result of wars and conflicts and things like that. Texas used to belong to Mexico, and then Texas was its own republic, and then it became part of the United States. So these things happen, and I think that's happened in Israel, particularly as a result of conflicts and wars, where Israel's had to create more and more buffer against neighbors who have attacked. So that's what makes it complicated. But let's just say that that's ideal. Here would be my question. Okay, so who would govern? Who would be in charge of this Palestinian state? Is it because right now the only two organizations that claim to speak for the Palestinians are Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. Both of them pay rewards to terrorists who kill, to the families of terrorists who die in terrorist attacks that kill Israelis. And the more Jews you kill, the more they reward you, the bigger your rewards are. They build statues and monuments. They don't build statues and monuments for peacemaking. They build statues and monuments for terrorists. In their school system, little children, time they're 4, 5, 6 years of age, they are taught that Jews are subhuman and that killing Jews is glorious. So these are the people that are going to be the government. These are the people that are going to be in charge. And what guarantees are there for Israel that, in fact, I think the guarantees are that any land you turn over in the world as it exists today, with the leadership that exists today in the Palestinian world, that territory is almost guaranteed to become a launch pad for Iran and the groups they sponsor. Because at the core of all of this, people think that the core issue in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian situation. It's not. The core issue in the Middle East is that Iran wants to be a dominant regional power. And the two things standing in their way from achieving that are the presence of the United States and Israel. They obviously, they want America, they want to drive us out of the region, which is why they have all these proxies attacking us, so that Americans will say it's not worth it, let's just get out of there. And then they want to destroy Israel. They can't beat Israel in a frontal military conflict, but they can make Israel an unlivable place. They can use their proxies in Iraq and Syria to move and topple Jordan. And then once they have a presence in Jordan, they can attack Israel from West Bank, from Gaza, from Syria, from Jordan, just surround it, make Israel an unlivable place, and then collapse it as a state. That's their goal. And that's what's driving all of this. And until that problem is solved, none of these other problems can be solved, because they are ones that are driving this irritant. And we have trouble accepting that reality. We think that the problem with Iran is just their nuclear ambition. It's much broader than that. They desire to be a regional hegemonic power, and to do it, they've got to drive America out of there. And then they have to make Israel an unlivable place so that the state, as we know it, would collapse. At that point, now they can move on Bahrain. They can, maybe they can never take Saudi Arabia, but they could go after all these other kingdoms, Gulf kingdoms that are much smaller in capability. They already have a presence in Yemen. And all of a sudden, Iran now becomes the most powerful country, and they have achieved their objective, which is to drive from the river to the sea, as they like to chant, every Jew out of there. a region with no Jews from the river to the sea, as they like to chant. And these idiots on the street don't even know what it means, or they do know what it means, pretend they don't know what it chants. But that's their objective, and that is at the core. That's the core problem.
And meanwhile, the president yesterday was announced is issuing a sanctions waiver for Iran again that'll allow $10 billion to flow to them for more purchase of oil. So it's the opposite. But what's crazy to me is the following: is before October 7th in American political discourse, at least in the halls of Congress privately, on both sides of the aisle, any sentient being, any smart person who really understands the issue even a little bit, would say to you, everybody knows that the two-state solution is dead. The idea of a two-state solution, it's not there. We got to find a different way. The Oslo's dead. We have to just keep our feet moving forward and keep pushing now the Abraham Accords and try to go at this through a different direction. And October 7th should have taken it even more to that direction, right? Saying, okay, these people, the Palestinians, can't govern. There's this fantasy that they can govern, that if they had just a little bit more land, they'd be peaceful. They've proven that that's not true. They had a quasi-state in Gaza, and we got what we got. We're having the violence in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank every single day, despite the president calling out the Jews there. It's actually the Arabs that are committing terror attacks on a daily basis there every single day. And meanwhile, American political discourse is going towards the direction of providing more rope for the Palestinians and more land and more ceding more to what they've been pushing for, actually showing them, and they say it themselves, as you know, that their strategy is working, because now they're closer to getting a state than they were before. And by the way, they also say, as you know, that getting a state is just one step closer to taking the whole thing from the river to the sea. And I just, for me, I would love to just get your opinion on that. Why is there such a disconnect between the reality, the objective reality, and what we're seeing come out of the mouths of so many leaders in our country?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. The first is I think our foreign policy leaders, particularly career bureaucrats at the State Department and others involved in think tanks, are some of the most gullible people. They just are. They don't live in reality. They think that every country in the world is some Western European nation or Belgium. There's a reality about the Middle East that requires to live with realism and understand what the factors are that are in place. And you've outlined one of them, which is the evidence of that is that there were very generous offers made 20 years ago for a Palestinian state, and they were rejected. They were flat out rejected. And they were rejected because they didn't go far enough, because their objective is not a state. Their objective is the entire, what today is known as Israel. That's their objective. So, and anything less than that is viewed as betrayal and is not rewarded. There's no reward for being a peacemaker, unfortunately, in Palestinian political circles these days. And so that there's just no one to negotiate. But people are very gullible. That's the first. And then you've got this whole anti-colonialism argument, where the argument they're basically applying to Israel is that I'm just paraphrasing what their argument would be, is that a bunch of Europeans, Jews, after the Second World War, basically colonized land that belonged to Arabs and drove them out of there. And so they're illegitimate. And that there's this whole anti-colonialism argument that's now being applied to Israel, which of course ignores 5,000 years of history and all kinds of archaeological and historical evidence of the fact that there's been a continuous Jewish presence in that part of the world throughout that period of time. But, that's what we're dealing with here. And unfortunately, it's become ingrained in our higher education system, in our popular culture, in Hollywood and the media, and certainly in global political circles as well. It's become deeply ingrained. And it's just one of those things where we're, one of those causes that's the right place to be. You're not going to win a lot of popularity contests. And so what you have to do is just say, I'm right, and I'm going to apply realism and strength to protect my position. And I hope that global public opinion and elite public opinion will one day change. But our insurance against it actually becoming policy is to remain firm and to apply strength and realism to the concept, to the situation that we face right now in that part of the world. And that is this, that the state of Israel would not exist if Israel was not able to defend itself and was not able to threaten its adversaries with overwhelming military capability and the will to do it, that it faces existential threats and that it needs to respond in kind. That's the reality today. Maybe one day we'll live in a world where that's not the case, but today, right now, that's the world we live in, and that's the world we've lived in for quite a while.
Thank you. All right. So final question, just because I want to respect your time. And because I could speak to you all day. I have so many follow-up questions on everything you're saying. So I really appreciate it. But how can we get Americans to understand the importance of what happens outside of our borders? What impact that has here on the home front? We're hearing more and more voices saying, whether it's part of the quote unquote America First movement, which means different things to different people, but really we keep hearing things on both sides of the aisle of why are we dealing with what's happening there. You serve on foreign affairs, on intelligence. You've been in the Senate for a while. I don't think anyone in the Senate knows more than you. I mean, you're there in the upper echelons there. Why is it that what happens outside of our borders impacts us directly here in America?
Well, I think we're seeing it in our own border. Why are people coming to the border of the United States? For two reasons. Number one, because the Biden administration put in place policies that have encouraged them to come. And number two, because they're leaving countries where there are problems. They're leaving socialism, Marxism, and narco dictatorship in Venezuela. They're leaving chaos in Haiti. They're leaving Marxism and failed communism in Cuba. They're leaving violence and everything that comes with what's happening in other parts of the world, in Africa and the Middle East. They're, I believe, coming because they're criminal. In some cases, they're part of criminal gangs that see the opportunity to go into the United States. All of this emanating from abroad. So those issues are relevant. The others are national security, our own interest. America is a big, powerful country, the most powerful in the world. We have global interests. We sell our products and goods, and Americans travel all over the world. And so we have interests in all parts of the world. Now, we have to prioritize those because we have domestic needs too. We're not in an era where we can go around being the government of the world and solving every problem on the planet. I look at the situation in Haiti. It's heartbreaking. It's very tragic. There's not a lot we can do about it, to be honest with you. We have very few options about what we do in that regard. And so I think we live in a period of time in which we have to be very smart about prioritizing what is in our national interest versus, what we have to do versus what we'd like to do. Because the have to do's are the ones we have to focus on. But we can't isolate from the world. The world's problems, just because we ignore them, they will not ignore us. We're America, and they will come for us.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you, Senator, for everything you do. And I know you're gonna push to get Israel's military assistance through somehow, some way, with all that back and forth and difficulties politically, internally, and you continue to do all the great work you're doing. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please subscribe, follow, do all those great things you do to support podcasts. And Senator Rubio, thank you so much for being a friend.
Thank you. I appreciate it.